Welcome, everyone. We are going to do 2 chapters tonight. We're in the section about numbers, the entire numerical coding in the Torah. And the first 2 chapters that we did for this section were gematria. Gematria of individual words, gematria of phrases, sometimes whole verses. But many people think that when you talk about the numerical coding in the Torah, it's all about gematria. But what we're going to see from now until we finish is the fact that numbers have many different methods other than gematria. So tonight we're going to do 2 of them. One is called Ordinal Numbering, and the second one will be what's called Mispar Katan. Ordinal Numbering is a different system than the usual gematria system, where every letter has a numerical value, Aleph being 1, all the way up to Tav, which is 400. Here, ordinal numbering is going according to its placement in the 22 Hebrew letters. So the whole system is only from 1 to 22. In other words, the first letter, the Aleph, has a value of 1 because it's the first in the series of Hebrew letters. And the Tav is 22 because it is the last one. Now, this is very connected to one of the chapters we had before about acrostics, where we learn that in the Torah, in the Psalms, later in Hebrew poetry and Zmirot and Piyutim, all the different types of prayer-like either poems or requests or prayers follow the Hebrew letters in their order. And we had a whole chapter about the logic behind this, because the Hebrew letters are the building blocks of creation. And so when the psalmist or different verses in the Torah or later poets would arrange their creativity according to the sequence of the Hebrew letters. So we saw that was not just like an organizational tool, but it was connected to divine creative energy process. So ordinal numbering is very close to this, because here its position in the Hebrew alphabet is what is primary. And as we'll see as we go through the whole section about numbering, different rabbis or Kabbalists or Hasidic rabbis or commentators over the years, some of them, in a sense, latch on to one of these methods. And for our regular listeners, we've discussed this, that Sean, who I see is on tonight, the system called Atbash, where you replace the first letter for the last letter and the second letter for the second last letter. For whatever reasons, that's like a big turn on for Sean. But we see that throughout the generations, different people just have a calling or have a pull to one of these methods. So as always, we're just going to pick a few of the examples of ordinal numbering. I can mention that Rav Ginsburg many times will use ordinal numbering to explain a deeper concept. And for those who remember, when we're delving into this idea of numbers, it's like putting a word or a phrase, or sometimes a whole verse or a whole parsha or a whole book under a microscope. And when you magnify to a greater degree, you see more and more things. So that's the same thing with all these different numbering methods. It's just turning up the focus to see how much you can see. This is the whole concept of Shivim Panim LaTorah, 70 faces to the Torah. You can take a word and you can apply many, 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 many different numerical methods to it. And each one will bring out a different idea. So we'll start, for those who have the book, on page 513. So this is, it's really an amazing one, is that the first verse of the Torah, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, Bereshit, bara Elokim et hashamayim ve'et haaretz. So in ordinal numbering, the words bara Elokim, that, one second. When you use ordinal method, it equals 64. Again, just so people understand, Bereshit bara, the bet is 2 because it's the second letter. The next one is Resh. Resh equals 21 because it's the 21st letter. And then you have the Aleph of Bereshit, that you add another 1. The Shin is, actually, I'm sorry, Resh is 20. Shin is 21, etc. So Bereshit bara, God created, equals 64. Equals 64. Sod is 70. Bracha, Sod is 70, not 64. The Samach and the Dalet, but there's always a Vav in there. Sod Hashem li Reyav. That's the whole idea of Shivim Panim LaTorah. It's the Sod. It's the inner dimension. So what's the significance that Bereshit bara equals 64? 64 is the numerical value of the word for din, judgment. And we have a midrash, a very, very important midrash, that says that in the beginning, God wanted to create the world solely with the midah of din, of judgment. Not like harsh judgment. It means midah keneged midah, that the world would work in perfect balance, measure for measure. That you do something, something will happen as a result of it. Causes and effects, and it would work like clockwork. But God saw there's no room here for tshuva. There's no room for tshuva. What happens if someone makes a mistake? If everything is din, then there's no fixing it. Once it's done, it's done. So God's joined rachamim into the equation of creation. So here we see Bereshit bara, in the beginning God created. So we see this midrash that God wanted to create it from din. That is the ordinal value of Bereshit bara. But if you look at the whole first verse, Bereshit bara Elokim et hashamayim ve'et haaretz, and you add up all of the letters according to their ordinal, it equals 298, which equals rachamim, which equals the attribute of compassion. So here you have in ordinal numbering really the secret of this midrash, Because in the beginning, God wanted to create from din, but in the end, he added in rachamim. And here you see, right in the first verse, it's almost encoded there, this midrash, this idea, this understanding of the balance between judgment and compassion, between a world that works like clockwork. And we should be very grateful, because if even for a split second, the force of gravity would be interrupted, well, all of life would cease. We'd all fly off the earth. So there's something wonderful about din. There's something wonderful about a clock, a perfect, balanced, measure for measure universe. But God saw that there has to be a place for tshuva. There has to be a place for free will to be able to be in the equation. So that is our first example. The next one is on page 514. And this is just from the parshat of Shalach, of sending the spies. So 10 of the 12 spies came back with a negative report, and only Caleb and Yeshua had something positive to say. So after the 10 spies told the people, we're not going to be able to go into the land, they're too strong for us, we just won't be able to do it. And the people are like crying, let's go back to Egypt. And so Caleb and Yeshua said, Tova ha'oretz ma'od ma'od. The land is very, very good. In other words, don't listen to these 10 spies. Tova ha'oretz ma'od ma'od. And so when you take that phrase, according to ordinal numbering, it equals 102. 102 is the word emunah, faith. And so what Caleb and Yeshua were saying, not only is it's a good land, but they were telling them, like, what happened to your faith? God promised to bring us into the land. And it's a land of faith. It's a land where God's word will be fulfilled. We can go into the land. So this term, Tova ha'oretz ma'od ma'od, the land is very, very good, equals 102, equals faith. And it also equals the word tzvi, deer. And I remember in a previous chapter when we were learning Atbash, like I mentioned before, this is Sean's favorite, is Atbash. So Moshe's name in Atbash is Tzvi, is the idea of a deer. And we know, so we learned that one of the ways that we refer to the land of Israel is Eretz Tzvi, the land of the deer. But the deer is symbolic because deer equals 102, equals faith. So by saying Eretz Tzvi, what we're really saying is it's a land of faith. And this is one of the deeper understandings of why Moshe Rabbeinu so much wanted to come into the land, because he believed that God would give us the land. And he wanted to be there. And just this last parsha here in Israel, at least next week for those outside of Israel, will be Parshat Chukat. This is when Moshe, instead of speaking to the rock, hits the rock twice to bring forth water. And in response, God says, because of this, you will not lead the Jewish people into Israel. That's a whole other subject. But there's one more point here, that this idea of ma'od, very, very, it doesn't appear very many times. Usually something is just very something. Here it's tovah ha'oretz ma'od ma'od. So in Pirkei Avot, so it says, but here's the opposite. The ma'od ma'od comes first. Ma'od ma'od havei shafal. A person should be very humble. Ma'od ma'od. And so some of the commentaries put these two together. Here, in our verse of the land of Israel, the ma'od ma'od comes at the end of the description, and in Pirkei Avot it comes in the beginning. Ma'od ma'od havei shafel. Person should be very existentially lowly in their own eyes. They should temper their ego, their pride. So some put it together is on the merit of being very humble, we acquire Eretz Yisrael. And that is part of the mystery of Moshe not being able to come into the land, because the Torah describes him as the most humble person on the face of the earth. So according to what we'll call natural logic, who deserved or who was more fitting to come into Israel than Moshe? Because he was so lowly in his own eyes. And that's part of the mystery, the paradox of this whole incident with Moshe hitting the rock twice. That is an entire class just to discuss that. But there is a deep connection between humbling our spirit and having the merit to be in Eretz Yisrael. I'll just mention, this just popped into my head, this very spontaneously, but after the 6-year war, there's no doubt, in a good way, Jewish pride was brought to new levels. Everyone thought Israel was about to be destroyed. The Arab nations announced their intention. And then in the Six-Day War, everything was turned around like miraculously. And there was no doubt for the years after that, there was a sense of invincibility in Israel and a little bit of undue pride in our own accomplishments. And of course, only 6 years later in the Yom Kippur War, so that bubble burst, totally burst. But here's a very, very deep connection to Tovah ha'oretz ma'od ma'od. The land is very good, and ma'od ma'od haveh shafel. Person should work very hard to temper their pride and their ego. Okay, our next example is on page 515. This also, it's just such a great example of what we're trying to say, is that each one of the numerical methodologies reveals something that we just wouldn't see even through regular gematria. So here we see that the numerical value of the word wisdom, chachma, the regular gematria is 73. According to ordinal numbering, it's 37. Now, 37 is in Hebrew is the word halev, the heart. Lev is 32. Halev, the heart, is 37. And not only that, but 37 is the midpoint of 73. Every odd number has a midpoint. Even numbers don't have midpoints. Odd numbers have midpoints. So the midpoint, the exact middle of wisdom is the heart. Now, this takes a little explanation because one of the biggest teachings from the Alter Rebbe and Tanya is Hamoach Shalit al Alev, the mind, the intellect, wisdom has to rule over the heart. In other words, the heart, the emotions, without proper direction, can go just all over the place. We all know our own emotions. Sometimes they're steady, many times they're rational, but we also know the times when our emotions run away from us or actually drag us along. At the same time, the Alter Rebbe, even though he said that, and it's a tremendous teaching in Chabad, that the mind rules over the heart, has to rule over the heart, the Alter Rebbe said, nonetheless, there are times when the heart must be listened to, that the wisdom of the heart sometimes transcends our colder logic. So here we see in this ordinal numbering, we have this whole teaching, because wisdom, chachma, its ordinal value is the heart, 37, and it's the midpoint. That's the amazing thing. 37 is the midpoint, and plus it's the inverse number. That we're going to have a whole chapter on inverse numbers. So the inverse number of 73 is 37. So that the whole teaching is condensed into these numbers. So I found that one quite amazing. The next example is it's actually the next one on page 515, that the letter tzadi in ordinal values is the 18th letter. And we know that 18 is always associated with life, with chai. So there's a deep connection with this letter tzadi and the idea of chai, life. So first of all, the Arizal, he actually called the letter tzaddik, not just tzadi. The word tzaddik, a righteous person, is the letter tzadi with a kuf at the end. So he actually called the letter tzaddik. And the idea here is the tzaddik is like the example of chai. It's we look to the tzaddikim to inspire us, to give us an appreciation of life force. And being in the presence of a tzaddik is empowering. It gives us life force. What's interesting is that some people actually refer to the Arizal as Ha'ari Achai, the Ari, the living one. And I heard from Rav Ginsburg, where did that come from? So it's interesting because this is a different type of numbering. It's actually ordinal numbering, but not of the Aleph Bet exactly. Is very soon we're going to be in the 3 weeks. The 3 weeks are the days between the 17th of Tammuz, which is a fast day, and Tisha B'Av, which is a fast day. So these are called the 3 weeks, and it has to do with the destruction of the temples and many other calamities that occurred in Jewish history. And so the Arizal passed away on the 5th of Av, Hey Av, which is the 18th day of the 3 weeks. And so this is a bit paradoxical. So some people started referring to him as Ari Achai on the day he passes away, on the 18th day. So like I said, this is like ordinal counting, but within a certain period. And actually, there are many commentaries that will comment on the numerical placing within a cycle. One cycle are the 7 weeks of counting Omer. And there's, we have Lag BaOmer, the 33rd day of the Omer, which has special significance. And also during Elul and the 10 days of Tshuva, there's significance to the day within that cycle. So here we have the tzaddik is connected to the letter tzadi, which is the 18th letter, which is connected to life. The next example we have is also on page 515. And here, this is one of the names of God, Aleph and Lamed, El, Kel, Aleph and Lamed. Aleph and Lamed equals 31 in regular gematria, but in ordinal counting, it equals 13. Again, it's an inverse number, 31, 13. 13, we always associate with 2 words, ahava, love, and echad, oneness. And of course, love and oneness go together very much. So we could ask, but what's the connection with love and oneness with this name of God? So we have a verse that chesed kel kol hayom, the kindnesses, the loving kindnesses, because the inner dimension of chesed is ahava, is love. That's the motivating force of acts of loving kindness, is love itself. So here, the name Kel, this verse is always brought as the example of the meaning of this name of God. One of the meanings is the chesed of God is throughout the day. In other words, constant chesed, that we're alive, there's a world, this is God's constant kindness. But here we see it in the ordinal counting, that this name of God equals 13, which equals love. And that's the connection, love and chesed, with this name. Now, we learned before that each of the names of God, there are many names of God, but they are associated with one of the sfirot. So the sfira that the name Kel is referring to is chesed. Is chesed. So here again, we see the ordinal number exemplifies a deeper understanding that we might not have picked up even from regular gematria. We might not have picked it up. Okay, so that is our first chapter that we're doing tonight. And you'll notice I keep on turning it off. For some reason, it gets fuzzy. So if I turn off the video and then turn it right back on, then it becomes clear again. So the next chapter we're doing is what's called Mispar Katan, little numbers or reduced numbers. This format, this method is all of the Hebrew letters are reduced to, it's like a decimal system, but it's 1 through 9. So in other words, the first 9 letters equal the first 9 numbers. But when you get to 10, 1, 0, well, that can be reduced to 1. 12, 11, 1 and 1 is reduced to 2. 13, 1 and 3 is reduced to 4. So this is called reduced numbers. What's the idea here? Again, I'm using the metaphor of a microscope, where here we're looking at the word in its, we'll call it its full power, its full manifestation. But what happens if we want to get down to the, we'll call it the lowest common denominator? Like what's like fueling this number for this word? So we get to it by what's called the reduced numbering, the lowest common denominator. So that's the idea of mispar katan. So our examples, the first one is on page 517. Here we'll go back to the word Bereshit. Now I just want to mention that this is going back over 40 years ago. Rav Ginsburg taught a class. For those of you who know Israel, know the Kotel, the Western Wall. So where the bathrooms are, there's a floor above it in a building, and that's a yeshiva. And now it's been refurbished and everything, but 40 years ago it was pretty sparse. Anyways, Rav Ginsburg taught a class there for 4 months, once a week for about 2 hours, on the first verse of the Torah. That's it. And anyone who's listened to Rav Ginsburg's teaching, 2 hours of class is like, whoa. So there were like 32 hours of classes on the first verse of the Torah. I still have all of the notes, and one day I would love to put out a book. Bezrat Hashem. Anyways, so here we just learned about Bereshit, but we learned it according to the ordinal numbering. So in Mispar Katan, so the word Bereshit equals 913. So 9 and 1 is 10, and 3 is 13. You could even do it another, which is like a second reduced, get it down to 4. But usually you stop at the first, usually. So Bereshit equals 13. Now we just learned about 13 with the name Kale. And we learned that the number 13 equals 1, and it equals love, ahava and echad. So here we see in the first verse of the Torah, this idea that the entire creation from the very inception, from Bereshit, is a manifestation of God's love. Here we see it through the reduced number. So that's just also a beautiful idea. And taking the same idea is that Bereshit equals 13 in Mispar Katan. And there's a tradition that when God taught Abraham about the covenant, when God brought or made a covenant with Abraham, and he commanded him with circumcision. So in that passage, the word brit appears 13 times. Brit means circumcision. And so the Gemara says, the sages say that God made 13 covenants with Abram. Really, he made one covenant. but they're emphasizing this idea of 13. Again, 13 means one. So it's really one covenant, but it had, we'll call it, it was like a crystal that had 13 facets to it. So what's fascinating is if you look at the first word of the Torah, and this is in Tikkunei Zohar, that the entire Tikkunei Zohar is permutations of the word Bereshit. So one of the permutations of Bereshit is Brit Eish, a covenant of fire. So here you see in the first word of the Torah, the concept of Brit, of a covenant that would eventually be made with Avram. 13 covenants. And the word Bereshit in Mispar Katan is 13. So this Brit Eish, a covenant of fire, it really applies to the covenant with Avram, but even deeper, that in modern cosmology, when you talk about the Big Bang, so what science explains is the initial creation was so hot that atoms couldn't even form. They use the term like it was like a plasma. Matter couldn't even form. It was so hot. And only as the universe began to expand and cool down could atoms and molecules even be formed. So it's amazing that's in the word Bereshit. In the beginning, there's a Brit Eish. There's this fire of creation already in the first word of the Torah. Now we're going to continue just with this word Bereshit. And tonight we could see, we've done it in Ordinal and in Mispar Katan, how much you can see in one word. I mean, the whole Tikkunei Zohar, which is an extensive book, is just permutations of the word Bereshit. So here, though, the first verse, Bereshit bara Elokim et hashmayim ve'et haaretz, in Mispar Katan, in reduced, equals 82. In other words, when you would add up all of the letters and all of the words, you add the words up, it comes to 82. So what is the significance of 82? I particularly really like this one because the very beginning of Sefer Yetzirah is with 32 pathways of wisdom. And it goes on, God created the world with 32 pathways of wisdom. We've learned this a number of times. What are these 32 pathways of wisdom? The 22 letters and the 10 sfirot. 22 and 10 equals 32. And that equals the 32 pathways of wisdom. So the amazing thing is, we said that the Mispar Katan of the whole first verse is 82. The first three words, Bereshit bara Elokim, equals 32 in Mispar Katan. So if the whole verse equals 82, that leaves 50. So according to our tradition, what do we associate with 50? The 50 gates of understanding. So here we have, and these 50 gates of understanding are very connected to the 49 days of the Omer, and then the 50th day is the receiving of the Torah, or 7 Shmitot, 7 sabbatical years times 7 equals 49, and the 50th is the Jubilee year. So this is very connected to what are called the 50 gates of understanding. So it says in the Zohar that Chachma and Bina are two beloveds that never separate. And Chachma is always called Abba, and Bina is called Ima, father and mother. And they're two beloveds that never separate. So here you see an amazing thing. In the first verse of the Torah, the first the first three words in Mispar Katan equals 32, the 32 pathways of wisdom. And the next four words equal 50, which are the 50 gates of understanding. So here you see in the first verse what would be called the unification of Chachma and Bina, of Abba and Ima. And in a sense, these are the sfirot that are used by God in order to create the world. So I just thought that was just an amazing, amazing idea. One second. The next one is on the bottom of page 518. This is I would call it a fun one. A lot of people have heard this in different ways about Shabbat. Shabbat, why is it doing this? Shabbat is also called Yom Shvi'i, the seventh day. Sometimes it's called Shabbat or Yom HaShvi'i, the seventh day. But either way, the whole secret of Shabbat is the number 7, the seventh day. So it's brought down, and there might be more than what I'm saying here. There might be more, is that many, many things associated with Shabbat, when you apply Mispar Katan, ends up equaling 7. So I'm just going to bring some examples. Is the greeting for Shabbat is Shabbat Shalom. That's the traditional way we greet people on Shabbos, Shabbat Shalom. So Shabbat equals 702, Shalom equals 376. Together they equal 1078. So when you add 1 and 7 and 8, it equals 16. That's again what we'll call the Mispar Katan. It equals 16. And 16, when you do it the second level, 1 and 6 equals 7. So the greeting in Shabbat, when you reduce it, it equals 7. Then the word for the candles that we light, ner, nun equals 50, resh equals 200, it's 250, 2 and 5 equals 7. There's a big thing, this comes from the Arizal, of eating fish on Shabbos. So the word for fish in Hebrew is dag, daled gimel, daled equals 4, gimel equals 3, 4 and 3 is 7. And for many people, obviously not the vegetarians and the vegans out there, but many people will eat meat. Some people only eat meat on Shabbos and Yontif. The word in Hebrew for meat, basar, equals 502. 5 and 2 equals 7. Challah. Everyone loves challah on Shabbos. The gematria of challah is 43. 4 and 3 equals 7. We drink wine. Wine equals 70, which is reduced to 7. And the blessing we make is Borei Priya Gafen. And Gafen equals 133. 1 and 3 and 3 equals 7. So I call this like a more fun one. And I think there's a few other ones I might not have gotten in there that is very traditional on Shabbat. And they all come down to 7. So that's an interesting one. Okay, the last one we're going to do is on page 520. And this has to do with the name of Hashem. The name of Hashem, the 4-letter name of Hashem, Yud and a Hey and a Vav and a Hey equals 26. 2 and 6 equals 8. And it's interesting also because Torah equals 611. 6 and 1 and 1 equals 8. And we always say that the Torah is the revealed will of God. But number 8, we know, always represents something that transcends the natural cycles of 7. 7 always represents cycles, so many ways that we count time. 7 days and Shabbat, 7 weeks of the Omer, 7 months. Those are the months of the 3 major holidays, Pesach, Shavuos, and Sukkot, all happen in the first 7 months of the year. The Shemitah year, the 7th year, and then 7 times 7 Shemitah years. So the way we count time is holy time is in increments of 7. And 8 always represents one level above 8. The Shlomo's pointing out that the infinity sign is an 8 on its side. And that is very, very, very connected. So here we see that the name of God, the most important name of God in Mispar Katan is 8, and the Torah itself is 8. Now, what it means is not that God and the Torah do not relate to this world. They very much relate to this world, but they're coming from a more transcendent level. It's not confined to the cycle, the natural cycles of the material physical world. That godliness and holiness and the Torah itself is coming from a higher transcendental place. So those are our examples for these 2 types of numerology, of the usage of numbers. And in future weeks, we are going to continue, and we're actually going to move away from the whole idea of gematria and moving to the level of the counting how many letters in a verse, how many words in a passage, how many times does a word appear in a parsha in the Torah. And that's why in Hebrew, a scribe is called a sofer, a counter. And this has been our point since we began this section of numbers, is that there is a whole mathematical code running through the Torah, and the Sofrim, those who wrote the Torah, they had a tradition. They understood all these different levels of many dimensions that are alluded to or hinted to in the numbers of the Torah. And we will be continuing with that.